It's a golden anniversary, 50 years of the Wilderness Act, now protecting more than 100 million acres.
All over the country, people have figured out that this is the strongest form of protection.
At least 210,000 gallons.
A ruptured pipeline floods an Arkansas suburb with crude tar sands oil.
Benzene, cyclohexene.
I was getting sicker and sicker.
What can be done to make sure it doesn't happen again?
We want them to get this mess cleaned up and get it cleaned up right.
And a scientist roams the world and finds microorganisms in plants that can be processed to make fuel.
That's totally fungal biodiesel.
So let's fuel up and move on with This American Land. Funding for This American Land provided by the Weiss Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trusts, and the Turner Foundation.
Hello and welcome to This American Land. I'm Caroline Ravel.
And I'm Bruce Burkhart with some great stories today about conservation of America's natural resources and about people of all ages and walks of life dedicated to conservation. Our first story marks a big anniversary for the Wilderness Act. 50 years ago, President Johnson signed the law, starting a new chapter in America's special connection to its wild and unspoiled landscapes. Under the Act, Congress designates areas that are already nearly pristine and roadless, protecting them from any development. After 50 years, the Act now protects 757 wilderness areas across the country, covering more than 109 million acres. But there are still many more areas that deserve protection, and the Wilderness Act is still an essential law in the cause of conservation.
Everybody, I think, comes to wilderness with a different background and sees it under a different light that is personal. The light never is the same. The ground is never the same. It always is under a constant state of change.
There's more and more demand for places to get out, to enjoy solitude.
You can feel a sense of maybe it's your own unimportance in light of the huge, vast country that you're part of.
As their public lands, there is a public responsibility to get involved and help take care of these areas.
Wilderness is a place where you can find solitude, and I know that that's a term that a lot of people use, but I think that we can define what it isn't. And that's the sort of noise of civilization that you have almost all of the time kind of buzzing in your ear. And I think what wilderness is to me is a chance to escape that noise. So that's why I think that the Wilderness Act is still important, still very relevant.
The two bills that I'm signing this morning are in the highest tradition of our heritage as conservators as well as users of America's bountiful natural endowments. This is a very happy and historic occasion for all who love the great American outdoors, and that, needless to say, includes me.
Wilderness is a uniquely American idea, the idea of valuing the wildest places in nature because they're wild.
My name is Doug Scott. I'm a retired congressional lobbyist for the Pew Charitable Trusts and the Sierra Club.
Then the next step, getting the Congress of the United States to pass laws preserving those areas. A wilderness area is an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man is a visitor who does not remain. I have two favorite wilderness areas. One is in the Brooks Range of central Alaska. It's 13 million acres, and I've spent a month there. My other favorite wilderness area is 26 miles from Times Square in suburban New Jersey. It's ringed by houses and roads. This Wilderness Act was conceived to have that breadth. You can have wilderness areas that are literally on the city limits Across the entire United States, the wilderness areas comprise just shy of 5% of the entire landmass of our country. But there's people working to see much more preserved, because all over the country, people have figured out that this is the strongest form of protection.
There's really nothing else quite like this place, and I've been working to protect it now ever since.
You see different kinds of formations.
And they covet that protection for some area that they know and love.
I've been coming out here for 37 years.
Of course, good place for game. There's some fisheries values in places out here. Just an intact ecosystem yet, one of the best left.
You don't just get to come and take. You have to give back because it doesn't let you have it easily.
We have some areas that are just so stunning and so spectacular that they receive a tremendous amount of use, and that's what these public lands are for.
All right.
But we live in an era when we no longer have big Forest Service trail crews. We have big nonprofit volunteer-driven trail crews. And the biggest challenges are, how do we get the public to be aware that it's volunteers and partners that are going to help address those challenges that wilderness faces today?
Wilderness, to me, is a gift to people. I think it's a place where people can go and watch nature operate on its own without too much disturbance. So I think it has something for all people in it.
It took Howard Zahnizer almost a decade to get the act itself passed, really working in a bipartisan way to get the language right that would get it through Congress and get it the support that it needed. And that was his genius, I think.
We enact into law today by signing these far-reaching conservation measures that a far-sighted nation has ever coped with.
And we celebrate that anniversary because it will have preserved, in the strongest way possible, nearly 5% of the landmass of the United States. It will have improved the economic potential of the rural communities. It will have offered recreational and spiritual opportunities to millions of American people. 3 or 4 generations from now, people look back at us. They will be grateful that we did this.
Our next stop is Mayflower, Arkansas, where a rupture in an oil pipeline in 2013 surprised suburban homeowners by flooding their streets with crude oil. Many of them didn't even know there was a pipeline under their yards. To find out more about this event, we co-produced this 2-part investigative story with Inside Climate News, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting unit.
You could come down this area, this road right here behind me, and you could see chunks of tar just left along the road.
We're talking at least 210,000 gallons.
Yes.
Which translates to 5,000 barrels. A lot of the pipelines are carrying this bitumen, and it needs to be diluted. We've got benzene, cyclohexene, ethylbenzene, hydrogen sulfide.
But I knew whatever it was, I was getting sicker and sicker.
It's an 850-mile long pipeline.
You're talking about an oil pipeline put into the ground when Harry Truman was president of the United States.
ExxonMobil now owns this pipeline. That's the whole line of the Pegasus, and the whole thing has been shut down since this rupture.
I think the biggest thing that I've learned is that we're just not prepared for this type of catastrophe.
There's a lot of hurt here. I mean, these people feel as if they were kind of disposed of.
We haven't had any help. That's what really, excuse my language, pisses me off.
This was ground zero for the rupture of the Pegasus pipeline that happened on March 29th. oil was running down this street right here, and so that's why there were 2 homes behind that barrier that Exxon has bought and decided to raise because they could not be de-oiled. 22 families were evacuated. As I understand it, some of those families have moved back in. Clearly, there are a lot of for sale signs in the neighborhood.
Yes.
People don't want to live here anymore. And I know that Exxon has made some sort of an arrangement.
They'll pre-appraise their homes, and after 120 days of being on the market and no hits, and then Exxon will come in and talk about buying your home from you.
But I don't know what I'm going to do. If this turns into rental property and it goes downhill, I'm gone. And I'm 77 years old. It's not exactly easy for me to move.
That man, you could tell, was very
distraught. Yes.
Right. He said this was going to be our final nesting place.
And that was what a lot of families did here.
These people had no idea that there was an oil pipeline literally in their own backyard.
The soil is dark black.
So, Genevieve, you became a citizen advocate because you were worried about the health of people. You were worried about the health of the lake that you grew up on.
Your nose would burn, your eyes would burn, you would instantly get dizzy, nauseous. And that are some of the effects that still the residents are going through to this day.
Headaches, throwing up, diarrhea, blurred vision. So I went to my doctor several different times. He said, I do not want you to go back to your house.
We had a conversation with JARRELL. She lives over on this Snugs Circle, which is adjacent to the Northwood subdivision where the 22 homes were evacuated. They were not even told that they should voluntarily evacuate. They were just kind of left behind.
I'm 300 yards from the rupture site. I have a 3-month-old baby laying in my home.
Right.
24/7, breathing this stuff in. My grandson, there he is.
There's a little one.
That is him taking his inhaler. He has to have it once in the morning and once at night. And you can tell he does not like it.
Okay. He was not using an inhaler.
No, he was not using
March
it. He was.
29th.
You know, everybody knows there's 22 houses that were evacuated. Well, you know what? We were not evacuated, so we've been sitting here breathing it in.
This just speaks to the issue with these oil spills. People assume, oh, the authorities are going to help us.
Right.
We're going to be taken care of, but there is no blueprint to follow.
Yes, there needs to be a plan put in place. What do you do if something happens? You need to plan it before it happens.
Well, Ann moved here 3 years ago.
Right, and this was her dream house.
It's a nice little house inside.
She can't live here anymore. What would you like to see happen? I mean, here you're...
Well, it's too late for anything to happen. It's too late for us. I mean, it's too late. We want them to get this mess cleaned up and get it cleaned up right.
There are concentric rings, you know, that get tighter and tighter down to ground zero. But just because you're in the second ring or the third ring of impact doesn't mean that you are not impacted.
We're here with the Attorney General of Arkansas. He's the one who can wield a hammer against Exxon. The people feel somewhat helpless to do that. The victims of the spill, he's the guy who has the power of a lawsuit.
It's been very frustrating. Arkansas did not anticipate this kind of environmental disaster. We've certainly never experienced this kind of environmental disaster. And I've been trying to work with the Arkansas Department of Health. Admittedly, this is somewhat outside of their normal mission. I know that there are citizens who feel like they've been well taken care of and feel like they have been treated with dignity and respect and concern from day one.
Right there is where it hit, where that truck's at.
There's also a lot of citizens who don't feel that way.
If you speak out, you're speaking up against a multi-billion-dollar company.
We had a substantial release. It did significant damage to water, air, and soil. We had state hazardous waste laws that were violated.
Most people living in Mayflower probably never expected that they could be hit by a flood of oil leaking from that pipeline. Now they know better, and they worry about the pipeline's threat to their water supplies. Here's part 2 of our report.
Here we are in Mayflower, and one of the first significant sites is the boom, which is a remainder of the spill that happened March 29th. On your right-hand side, you see the cove, which is a small part of the larger Lake Conway to your left. The workers converged here because the spill had happened about 9/10 of a mile up. You know, the oil was coming this way from where it spilled in the subdivision, and they knew they had to mound up gravel to keep the oil from compromising the main lake. This is such a valuable recreational resource. They were afraid that if the oil got in here, what was a somewhat of a disaster would turn into a catastrophe. We're talking with the Game and Fish Commission of Arkansas, and this man, Tom Bly, is in charge of their fisheries program, and they are involved in this cleanup. What went through your head when you heard that this had happened?
Actually, there was relief because I knew that we had good control over that cove, Dawson Cove, the affected area.
So this was on 623. I'm standing on top of the dam. This is one that
a lot of the people in the community, you know, they take photographs of 7 or 8 dead fish together.
There is a layer of black that runs through the gills.
Most people in the affected area stuff are really thinking emotionally, and you know they're seeing things emotionally, and I want to see it emotionally. I've worked on this lake for 25 years, but you got to think clearly and comprehend what you're seeing. 7 or 8 dead fish is not dead fish. You know, when you have hundreds or thousands, then you know you've got something there that's causing those fish to die.
It is a recreation spot, and if there is oil in that lake, that's going to scare people away from this resource that is a point of pride across Arkansas.
I think, unfortunately, through what happened at Mayflower, it did bring awareness to this area of what if. You can step in. This is the Little Red River. If an event did occur, there was some sort of spill that would take place, just the thought that, uh-oh, the river is contaminated, it begins to trickle down that how it will affect the economy.
We're talking with Lowell Myers, who has been a guide for the last 2 or 3 years on the Little Red River.
This is the pipeline. I don't know if this pipeline is 2 feet underneath those rocks. I don't know if it's 5 feet. I don't know if it's 20 feet. I have no idea.
You could probably count the people on 2 hands who knew it was there. So the fact that this rupture happened was an education to people about the fact that oil pipelines even exist in Arkansas and where they run.
I have been fishing this area probably for 18 years. I had no clue.
You're gonna go right, go through the backyard of a daycare, right behind the back playground. People don't know it goes through their backyard. They don't know what's there. There it is.
And there's one of the round markers. So Megan is an interesting story. She heard about the Mayflower spill, and to her credit, she stepped up and started doing her own research.
I went online and I pulled up the map that showed this is where the pipeline is. You know, and I said, you know, I don't think this map is right. So the little red marker line is where I went out and drove and said, okay, this is where I see it, this is where I see it, this is where I see it. I mean, it's right there.
These things happen, and the press interest dies down, and they assume, oh, it must be done. It must be finished.
Well, because, you know, it happened in Mayflower.
Right.
It didn't happen in Conway.
Right, exactly.
But it is here, and it is our problem. You know, I don't think they should ever turn it back on.
About 1 in 4 people in this state counts on drinking water from a water source that is crossed by the Pegasus.
There's a number of questions that need to be answered before we can even start talking about whether or not this pipeline is going to operate again. I'm John Tynan, Watershed Protection Manager for Central Arkansas Water. Lake Maumelle is our primary drinking water source.
The Mayflower spill happened just 8 pipeline miles away from this watershed. That is huge cause for concern for this utility, and they are pushing Exxon to either abandon or relocate this pipeline out of their watershed. This is an oil pipeline, right? This is what it looks like.
This is one of about 18 places in the watershed where the Pegasus pipeline crosses over a stream or some body of water that feeds into Lake Maumelle. 400,000 people depend on this drinking water supply. So our questions are, why did it happen in Mayflower? Why now and why at that location?
When Exxon made it known that Pegasus was carrying something called diluted bitumen, that made you look at your emergency response plan because this oil is heavier.
We're having to go back and update those to address a product that may have the potential to both float and sink.
Now, this section of the Pegasus, as I understand it, is obviously visible and should not be.
We're in the middle of a stream bed right now. We could have some of these large rocks striking the pipe. We could have timber debris getting backed up and causing, additional pressures on the pipeline that frankly it wasn't designed to handle. Exxon manages 850 miles of the Pegasus pipeline, and only 13.5 of that is through the Maumelle watershed. So we do understand that. But we, as the provider of water to 400,000 people, owe it to them to make sure that we do a thorough evaluation of this pipeline and do everything we can to prevent its restart until we are assured that the situations that led to the rupture in Mayflower aren't present in the watershed.
One of the vice presidents of Exxon did come out and say there is a distinct possibility that this pipeline might not operate again. The federal regulators have said, as far as they're concerned, it will not run until it is deemed safe. So the waiting game is still going on.
Now in our Science Nation report with Miles O'Brien, we meet a scientist who has searched the globe collecting plants, discovering fungi and bacteria in some of the tissues of these plants that can be converted into a diesel-like fuel. For that story, we go to Montana State University in Bozeman.
Yes, small round leaves. Tell us about how it's used for women's medicine.
Over his 50-year career, Montana State University plant pathologist Gary Strobel has traveled to all 7 continents, collecting samples from remote, sometimes dangerous places.
This should be good. It's got nice fleshy tissue. We found a fungus that makes Taxol, first billion-dollar anti-cancer drug. Fungi that make new antibiotics.
With support from the National Science Foundation, Strobel and colleagues have also discovered that certain organisms within plants, called endophytes, have the ability to make diesel-like fuels.
Endophytes are microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, that live within the living tissue of a plant.
One hydrocarbon-producing fungus comes from the olmo tree of Patagonia. Another is a citrus fungus from Florida.
Okay, bud.
Strobel and engineer Eric Booth showed us how they make the diesel-like fuel, putting the citrus fungus in what they call a paleobiosphere.
The basic idea is to mimic and simulate all the important parameters from an ancient forest. Water circulation, air circulation, into something that we can use in the laboratory.
You see the fungal growth in there as it has started to decay the leaf material?
It takes Mother Nature tens of millions of years to turn organic material into fuel. Strobel and Booth can make a small amount in 3 weeks using the paleobiosphere, and the fuel is the real thing.
We can tell that if the hydrocarbons made today are identical to the ones made then. The fungus does not require sugar, starch, corn to grow. It'll grow on leaves, a given amount of plant material.
Strobel says the long-term goal is to improve the process of using microbes that degrade plant material, especially agricultural waste, to make economically feasible quantities of hydrocarbons.
Here's the flame. That's totally fungal biodiesel that runs that.
In addition to fuel and medicine, Strobel says these fungal products could also be useful in plastics and green chemicals, all from a little endophyte. That's music to the ears of this plant pioneer.
Now here's a quick look at a story from our next show.
It's like the lost city down there. The structure is there, the habitat's incredible, the coral is incredible. There are not that many fish. If we protect it, they will come back.
Thanks for watching, and remember you can catch us anytime at thisamericanland.org. We'd like to hear your comments and ideas about stories you think we should cover. We'll see you next time.
For more information about this program, visit thisamericanland.org. Funding for This American Land provided by the Weiss Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trusts, and the Turner Foundation.